When the rescue team from the Turkestan military district reached the pass in September 1926, they expected to find dead people. They prepared to exhume the bodies and collect documents and weapons. But they weren't prepared to find a living person. He was a third-rank commissar, the commander of the missing expedition. He was found in a shallow cave littered with the gnawed bones of mules. He was completely naked and covered in a crust of dirt mixed with alien fur. But the horror wasn't in his appearance. The horror was in his demeanor. When the regimental doctor accidentally dropped his metal cigarette case on a stone, a loud click was heard. The sound instantly changed the demeanor of the newly discovered commissar. The grown man, a Civil War veteran, collapsed on all fours. His pupils dilated and thick drool began to flow from his mouth. He made no attempt to speak. He whined and stared devotedly into the cave's darkness, awaiting his command. The doctor, familiar with Academician Pavlov's work, turned pale and recoiled. This was no madman. Before him stood a creature whose reflexes had been completely rewritten over the course of 3 weeks. Someone or something in these mountains wasn't just killing people. It trained them. It used pain and fear as tools, turning the pride of Soviet power into obedient lab rats. The doctor recorded in the protocol that the subject had lost his human personality as a result of systematic external influence. But he did not dare to write what exactly could break the will of a Chekist accustomed to torture in the basements of the Lubyanka. The only material evidence of what happened to the squad before this monstrous training began is the object now lying on the expert's table. This is the legendary Mauser K96, the weapon of the commissars, a symbol of power and the inevitable retribution of the revolution. The pistol was found in the same cave, half buried in bat droppings. Usually such things are kept in museums under glass, but this specimen only makes the curators want to wash their hands with bleach. Its wooden buttstock, crafted from durable walnut, looks like it's been through a rock crusher. But that's not due to mechanical damage. Deep grooves are clearly visible on the varnished wood. These are the marks of incisors. The bite marks are 12 centimeters wide. Neither wolves nor bears have such a jaw arch. But the most terrifying thing is revealed when you look at the trunk itself. Alloyed gun steel, designed for high pressure of powder gases, is flattened. Someone clamped the barrel with their teeth, sealing the last bullet forever in the chamber. Ballistics experts calculated the required force. To deform a Mauser's barrel like that, you'd need a pressure of 300 atmospheres. It's biologically impossible, according to known science. But metal doesn't lie. Microscopic particles of enamel remained on the steel, which are 3 times harder than human enamel. We hold in our hands proof that the Pamir Mountains are home to a predator capable of biting through a rifle like a dry branch. The story of this failure began in Moscow, in the offices of the Special Department of the OGPU, under the Council of People's Commissars. Gleb Boki, the head of this secret unit, was obsessed with the idea of putting mysticism at the service of communism. In 1925, when the country had barely recovered from the famine, he secured a gigantic budget for the expedition. The goal wasn't gold or geological exploration. The secret directives contained a single word: Shambhala. Boki believed that in the heart of Asia, there was hidden an ancient civilization that possessed technologies of mental control. He wanted to obtain this weapon to ensure the victory of the world revolution. A special detachment was formed to accomplish this task. It included 25 fighters, selected on the basis of absolute loyalty and the absence of moral barriers. These were men who had been through the crucible of war, accustomed to sleeping in the saddle and killing without hesitation. They were equipped with the latest technology: brand new English Lewis machine guns, boxes of Mills grenades, warm sheepskin coats, and alcohol. The parade was commanded by that same commissar, whose name we are not disclosing for ethical reasons. He was confident of success. He believed that there was no defense against the revolver and the mandate, neither on earth nor in heaven. He was mistaken. He forgot that mandates don't work in the mountains, and a bullet is just a piece of lead that can bounce off too thick skin. The expedition diary, found next to the battered Mauser, begins cheerfully, almost cheerfully. The commissar's handwriting is clear, the letters even, the pressure strong. The first pages describe the long train journey to Tashkent, then the transfer to trucks, and finally, the transition to horses and mules. The detachment moved quickly, ignoring the warnings of local residents. The Chekists laughed at the elders' stories of snowmen and mountain spirits. For them, these were relics of the bourgeois past that had to be eradicated through education or execution. On September 5th, the detachment crossed the line of eternal snows. The altitude was 4,000 meters above sea level. The air here becomes thin and sharp, like a razor blade. Every movement requires effort. But the people moved forward, driven by orders and their own pride. They felt like conquerors. They drove tent stakes into the ancient ice, lit fires of ancient juniper, and sang revolutionary songs that echoed off the rocks. They didn't know that this echo was their only listener, who would soon come to get to know them better. A change in tone appears in the second week of the journey. The commissar stops writing about world revolution. His notes become dry and disturbing. He writes about the strange behavior of the animals. The horses, accustomed to gunshots and explosions, began to go berserk. They chewed the bits until they bled, tried to break free from the leash and, strangest of all, constantly looked at one point on the slope. There, among the grey rocks, there was nothing but shadows. The dogs brought in to guard the camp were even worse. Enormous Caucasian shepherds, capable of killing wolves, tucked their tails between their legs and hid under the food carts. They refused to eat. They whined so quietly and pitifully, as if begging forgiveness from an invisible master. The commissioner attributed it to the thin air and magnetic anomalies. He ordered that rations be increased and that people be given an additional portion of alcohol. It was the standard solution to all problems. If something goes wrong, just push harder. But the mountains didn't respond to the pressure. The mountains waited. On September 17th, the first contact took place, which no one understood at the time. The sentry standing guard by the ammunition crates reported a strange sound. It wasn't a howl or a roar. It was a rhythmic thud, stone on stone. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock, knock. As if someone were transmitting a signal in Morse code, but using geological formations. The commissar personally went out to check the post. He illuminated the slopes with a powerful electric flashlight, its beam capable of piercing the darkness for 300 meters. The beam picked out only a pile of boulders and snowdrifts. No movement. But the sensation of the gaze was physical. The commissar writes in his diary, "The skin on the back of my head is itchy. I've only had this feeling once before, in 1919, when I was sleeping and someone held a knife to my throat. There's no one here, but I know we're not alone." The next morning, they found confirmation. One of the boxes of stewed meat had been opened. It hadn't been broken open with a bayonet or smashed with a rock. The can's tin had been neatly torn along the seam, as if it were paper. The metal edges were bent outward. The contents were gone. Not a drop of fat fell to the ground. Someone ate the canned food with surgical precision, leaving not a crumb behind. And this someone possessed fingers so strong they could tear tin plate like newspaper. It was this moment that became the point of no return. If they had turned back then, perhaps someone would have remained sane. But they continued on. They delved into a labyrinth of gorges where the sun appeared for only a couple of hours a day. The cliff walls closed overhead, creating the effect of a stone sack. Sounds were distorted here. Footsteps sounded like thunder, and whispers turned into hisses. And then the real game began. An invisible adversary began testing their reactions. At night, rocks began flying into the camp. They didn't just fall from the slope, they were deliberately thrown. The stones hit the tents, causing no harm but making it difficult to sleep. It was a classic attrition tactic. Sleep deprivation is the first stage of mental breakdown. The fighters became irritable. Fights broke out. The discipline that had been maintained by the fear of the tribunal began to crumble in the face of primal terror. The commissioner tried to restore order by threatening with that same award Mauser, which would soon turn into a piece of chewed metal. He shouted at the people, demanding they gather their bearings. But his voice was already lacking in eloquence. He too heard that rhythmic pounding at night, and he began to notice a pattern. A knocking sound was heard every time one of the guards lit a cigarette. The click of a lighter, the sound of a stone. The flash of a match, the sound of a stone. It was the development of a conditioned reflex. The creature was teaching them to fear light. On September 23rd, the first person disappeared. It was the radio operator, a young man from Petrograd. He went outside the camp perimeter to adjust the antenna. The radio crackled with static. There had been no contact with headquarters for 3 days. The guy was gone in a second. No one heard the scream. The only sound was the sound of a dropped headset. When the squad rushed out to the noise, they found only the headphones hanging from a juniper bush. The wire connecting the headphones to the radio was torn. Traces of saliva remained on the insulation. Thick, viscous, smelling of ammonia and rot. There were no marks on the rocks. The radio operator was simply lifted into the air. The commissar ordered fire into the darkness. 10 Lewis guns rained lead onto the rocks. Tracers drew fiery lines across the night. The roar of the gunfire drowned out the wind. It seemed the sheer density of fire would destroy all life within a kilometre. When the gunfire died down, they heard a response. A sound like laughter came from the darkness. A low, guttural, vibrating sound that made people's diaphragms vibrate. This creature didn't fear the gunfire. It laughed at their attempts to defend themselves. It knew the bullets wouldn't hurt it if it didn't show itself. No one slept that night. Everyone sat back to back, clutching their rifles with whitened fingers. And from the darkness came a smell. The smell of wet wool and fresh blood. The scent of a predator playing with its food before eating. After a night of shooting into nowhere, Commissar Volkov's diary changes its rhythm. The bravado disappears. The slogans vanish. All that remains is a cold, sticky record of facts, interspersed with ink stains, as if the pen was shaking in a hand that was cramping. The next 3 days are described as a descent into a viscous nightmare. The squad did not turn back. Pride and fear of the tribunal drove them forward, into the mouth of the gorge, which was marked as a white spot on the map. But this wasn't just following a route. It was entering a zone where biological life ends and something else begins. On September 25th, they crossed an invisible line. It wasn't a state border. There were no border posts here. Nature itself marked the boundary. At midday, when the sun should have been at its zenith, the light suddenly turned dim and yellow like old parchment. The shadows cast by the rocks lengthened and took on irregular, jagged outlines. The air became thick like jelly. The soldiers complained of difficulty breathing, even though their altitude remained constant. The barometer carried by the expedition's geologist went crazy. The needle fell on the Buria and froze there, even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was the atmospheric pressure of hell. The first sign that they had entered the dead zone was the silence. It's never completely quiet in the mountains. There's always the sound of the wind, the crunch of scree, the cries of birds, the rush of water. But here, the sound was turned off. It was an acoustic vacuum. The footsteps of 30 men and a dozen horses were drowned out by the cotton wool. The people tried to speak, but their voices sounded muffled, as if they were speaking through a pillow. Even the jingle of harness and the clank of weapons seemed distant and unreal. Psychologists call this sensory deprivation. The brain, deprived of its usual background noise, begins to generate hallucinations. The soldiers began to look around. They felt as if someone was whispering their names in their ears. Some heard a child's cry. Some heard the sound of a passing train. These were phantoms born of fear. But the most terrifying thing was the animals' reaction. The horses, those hardy Turkestan racehorses, suddenly stopped dead in their tracks. They didn't snort or paw the ground. They simply stood there, heads bowed, shaking violently. Tears streamed from their eyes. The animals sensed something that people could not understand. They had entered a territory where they were no longer living beings, but canned food. When the commissar tried to strike the lead mule with a whip, the animal didn't even flinch. It had already resigned itself to death. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. The water in the canteens turned to ice, tearing apart the metal. The grease in the rifle bolts thickened, turning into glue. People wrapped themselves in sheepskin coats, but the cold penetrated beneath their skin, right down to their bones. It wasn't just frost. It was a cold that sucked the warmth from within. The unit's medic recorded the first cases of a strange frostbite. The skin on the fighters' fingers didn't turn white as usual. It turned grey like parchment and instantly lost all sensation. Yet the people felt no pain. They simply stared at their blackened nails with dull indifference. It was the apathy of the doomed. Volkov writes, "We walk as if in a dream. Our legs are heavy like cast-iron bollards. I look at the back of the guy in front of me and find myself wanting to shoot him in the back of the head, just to see something red against that damn grey background." The commander's psyche began to crack. He began to perceive his men not as comrades, but as props in a theatre of the absurd. It was in this atmospheric vacuum zone that biological anomalies began. Vegetation disappeared completely. Even lichens capable of living on bare rock were absent here. The rocks were bare and clean, as if polished with acid. But the most terrifying thing was the lack of insects. In the highlands, there are always gnats, beetles, and small creatures. Here, there was nothing. The biosphere was sterile. It was a sign that a super predator lived here and had cleared the area completely. Ecologists know that if there are no birds in the forest, it means there is something living there that eats even shadows. The diary contains an entry from September 27th. We found an eagle's nest on a ledge. It was huge, made of branches as thick as an arm. Inside were eggs. But they weren't broken. They were petrified. They were 100 years old. The birds left this place a century ago and never returned. We are dumber than birds. We came ourselves. That evening, the smell changed. The wind blowing from the glacier brought a new aroma. It wasn't the rotten smell they'd smelled before. It was a complex chemical cocktail. Volkov, who had experience working in chemical production before the revolution, tried to break it down into its components. The main smell was the pungent smell of ozone, which can be found after a strong thunderstorm or near a high-voltage arc. Mixed with it was a sweet, nauseating scent of musk and something else. Copper. The smell of old, oxidized blood. The smell wasn't repulsive in the traditional sense. It triggered panic at the reptilian level. These were death pheromones, the chemistry of fear. As soon as the scent reached the guard's nostrils, one of them started bleeding from the nose. His capillaries couldn't withstand the pressure surge. People started coughing, covering their faces with scarves. The air is poisoned, Volkov writes. It's not gas, it's the breath of the mountain itself. We inhale it, and it changes us from the inside. I taste iron in my mouth. Night brought new tactics from the enemy. They no longer heard the knocking. They saw a light. Far up the slope, about 500 meters above the camp, a small flame flared. Dim, greenish, like an overgrown firefly. It flashed 3 times and went out. A minute later, it lit up in a different place, a kilometer to the left. The creature, or creatures, moved at incredible speed. No man or beast can travel a kilometer along sheer cliffs in complete darkness in a minute. It was a demonstration of physical superiority. And once again, the Pavlovian effect kicked in. The fighters, exhausted and frightened, opened fire on the fire. Another crackle of gunfire, a flash of muzzle flash, and then silence again. The light died down, only to rekindle behind them. The monster played tag with them. He made them waste bullets, burn their nerves, scream into the void. He taught them that their reactions were predictable. He trained them to turn their heads in the direction he wanted. On the morning of September 28th, they found evidence of the night's visit. This time, it wasn't footprints. It was the architecture of madness. Stones were laid out around the camp, forming a perfect circle. Ordinary grey boulders, each weighing about 20 kilograms. But they were stacked on top of each other, forming columns half a meter high. Pyramids. It was like children playing with blocks. Only these blocks were assembled silently, while 30 armed men trembled in tents 10 meters away. Not a single guard noticed anything. The creature approached, formed its ritual circle, and left. It was a message. I can come whenever I want. I can enter your tents. I can take anyone. But for now, I'm just building. Volkov kicked one of the pyramids with his boot. The stones scattered. A crushed rat lay beneath the bottom stone. It had been flattened into a pancake, but its skin was intact. It was a seal, the master's signature. The detachment's psychological state entered a catatonic phase. People stopped talking. They did everything automatically. Saddled horses, ate canned food, and marched. Everyone's eyes were empty. This is the state of soldiers who have been sitting in trenches under artillery fire for a week. Their will is paralyzed. They awaited death as a release. Volkov attempted to organize a political briefing to lift their spirits. He spoke of duty, of the party, of the future, but his words were drowned out by the viscous air of the gorge. The soldiers looked at him as if he were crazy. One of them, an old Cossack, suddenly interrupted the commissar with a quiet question. "Comrade Commander, why isn't your shadow moving?" Volkov froze. He looked at his shadow on the stone. The sun was slowly creeping across the sky, but the commissar's shadow remained motionless, as if glued to the spot. Was it a hallucination, or had reality become so distorted that light no longer obeyed the laws of physics? The commissioner didn't answer. He simply pulled out his revolver and checked the cylinder. All 7 rounds were there. For now. By evening, they reached a narrow passage between the rocks, which Volkov called the Gate. It was a crevice no more than 3 meters wide. The walls rose hundreds of meters into the air, blocking out the sky. The darkness there was absolute, even during the day. From that darkness, came that same smell of ozone and copper, but now it was so strong it made one want to vomit. The horses refused to move. They lay down on the rocks, breaking their legs, but did not take a single step forward. The animals had to be abandoned. The men unloaded their packs and, staggering under the weight of their burdens, entered the darkness. As soon as the last soldier crossed the invisible threshold, a crash was heard from behind. A huge boulder fell, blocking the exit. There was no way back. They were trapped in the stone intestines, along with the one who waited for them there. Volkov's diary entry about this consists of a single sentence, written in very large letters that pierce the paper. "We are inside. It is here." The tunnel they entered was not a natural formation in the usual sense of the word. The geology of the Pamirs is chaotic. Jagged edges of tectonic plates, scree slopes, razor-sharp granite chips. But here the walls were smooth, as if they had been sandblasted by a giant machine. The stone was warm to the touch, which contradicted all the laws of thermodynamics in permafrost conditions. Commissioner Volkov, running his hand along the wall, felt a weak but distinct vibration. It sounded like the hum of a transformer box, only the frequency was below the threshold of hearing. The vibration was transmitted directly to the bones, causing nausea and dizziness. The streetlights revealed only greyish dust hanging motionless in the air. There was no convection here. The air was dead. People walked, trying not to make a sound with their hobnailed boots, but every step echoed loudly in their heads, as if they were inside a huge bell. 200 meters later, they came across the first physical evidence that different laws of physics were at work here. There was a pile of equipment lying in the middle of the passage. It wasn't their squad's belongings. These were the remains of a Basmachi caravan that, according to OGPU reports, had disappeared in this area a year earlier. At the time, it was believed they had fled to Afghanistan. It was now clear they hadn't even reached the pass. But it wasn't the presence of their belongings that was astonishing, but their condition. The Lee-Enfield rifles that the British supplied to the bandits were tied into a knot. 3 barrels of hardened gun steel were twisted together like the stems of a young willow. The metal showed no cracks or signs of heating. Someone took 3 rifles and simply tied them into a bow using cold deformation. The detachment's engineer, seeing this, turned pale and began wiping his glasses, muttering formulas for the strength of materials. To bend 1 tree trunk, you need a hydraulic press. To weave 3, you need a force capable of altering the steel's crystal lattice. It was a demonstration. The predator was showing that their weapons were just putty to him, but the real find was still to come. Around the bend, the tunnel widened into a grotto, the floor of which was strewn with bones. Here Volkov ordered a stop and to light the area with torches as the electric lanterns began to flicker and go out. The batteries were discharging at a catastrophic rate. In the flickering light of the fire, they saw what might be called a food chain inversion. Lying against the wall was the carcass of a Tian Shan brown bear. It was a male weighing at least 400 kilograms, the king of the local mountains, an encounter with which usually ends in death for anyone without a large caliber gun. But here the king was deposed. The bear wasn't torn to pieces, he was turned inside out. His skin was whole, without a single cut, but his body resembled an empty sack. The skeleton was missing. Someone had removed all the bones from the carcass without damaging the skin, except for 1 hole in the neck area. It looked like the work of a master taxidermist who decided to play a prank on nature. But nearby on the wall was a mosaic. The bear's skull, ribs, and spine were pressed into the rock at a height of 3 meters. They were not glued in place. They were pressed into the granite, as if the stone had momentarily become liquid, accepted the bones, and then hardened again. The expedition's doctor, an old surgeon who had served in the German war, approached the bear's remains. His hands, clad in rubber gloves, were shaking. He made an incision in the skin to examine the tissue. What he saw made him recoil and wipe the sweat from his forehead, leaving bloody streaks on his face. The bear's muscle tissue was converted into a homogeneous jelly. This is called traumatic hydrolysis. This happens when a body is hit by a shockwave of monstrous force. For example, when a heavy landmine explodes nearby. The shockwave passes through tissue, rupturing cell membranes, but leaving the outer shell intact. But there was no evidence of an explosion here. There was no smell of gunpowder here. It smelled only of musk and ozone. He wasn't beaten, the doctor whispered, looking at Volkov with wild eyes. He was squeezed. They squeezed it all at once, from all sides, like a tube of toothpaste. The pressure must have been around 100 atmospheres, instantly. Volkov looked at the bear jelly and realized that his Mauser was useless here. If this creature is capable of creating a pressure of 100 atmospheres with its limbs, then a 7.62 bullet is like a mosquito bite to it. But he couldn't show fear. He was the commander. He walked up to the wall with the sunken bones and tried to pry out a rib with a knife. The Solingen steel blade clanged and broke. The bone became part of the monolith. This was the architecture of madness. The monster didn't just kill, it created. He created installations of his victims, marking his territory. This spoke of a high level of intelligence and a sense of aesthetics, albeit a monstrous one. This wasn't a beast operating on instinct. This was a maniacal collector for whom biological organisms were simply creative material. The group moved on, stepping over the remains. Now every step was a struggle, not because of the height, but because of the primal terror that gripped their muscles. People began to notice a strange substance on the floor. They were drops of thick, glow-in-the-dark mucus. The doctor took a sample on a slide and held it to the fire. The slime hissed and evaporated, releasing a cloud of acrid steam that made the eyes of those standing nearby water. Acid, the medic stated. High concentration, probably a mixture of gastric juice and, I don't know, something fluoride-based. This explained how the bear bones ended up in the stone. The creature secreted a substance capable of softening granite. This was biology taken to the extreme. A living chemical factory, designed to penetrate anywhere and destroy anyone. The psychological breakdown occurred within an hour. One of the soldiers, a young machine gunner, suddenly stopped and started laughing. It wasn't hysterical. It was the quiet, joyful laugh of a man who suddenly understood a joke that no one else had heard. He pointed into the darkness of a side branch of the cave. "Look," he said in a calm, matter-of-fact voice. "That's my mother. She's making soup. She's calling me to dinner." Before anyone could react, he stepped into the darkness. Volkov shouted, "Stop!" but it was too late. The machine gunner disappeared into the black abyss. A second later, a sound came from there. Not a cry of pain, and the sound of an overripe watermelon bursting when you throw it hard onto the pavement. A wet, squelching pop. And silence. No struggle. There was no resistance. The man simply stepped into the darkness and ceased to exist as a coherent entity. Volkov fired 3 shots into the opening. Flashes of gunfire illuminated the narrow corridor for a moment. There was no one there. Only a fresh puddle glistened on the floor, and what had been the machine gunner's face a second ago was slowly sliding down the wall. The remaining fighters huddled together, bayonets pointed in all directions. It was the reaction of a herd attacked by wolves, but their bayonets trembled. People were breathing heavily, the air whistling into their lungs. Volkov saw the knees of the veterans who had been in the trenches shaking. They were faced with something their brains refused to process. War, that's understandable. There's an enemy, there's a front, there's the rear. Here, there was no front. The enemy was everywhere. He was in the walls, in the floor, in the darkness. He was space itself. Volkov realized they were not in a cave. They were inside the digestive tract of a giant organism, and the digestion process had already begun. "Move!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "Don't stand there. If anyone stops, I'll shoot them myself." This threat, absurd in its essence, brought people back to their senses a little. The habit of obeying orders turned out to be stronger than the fear of death. The squad, having lost one man and the remnants of their sanity, rushed forward towards the exit, which perhaps no longer existed. At the end of the grotto, they found another artifact. It was a field bag hanging from a stalagmite. The leather was old, cracked, and covered in mold. Volkov tore it off and opened it. Inside were documents in German. The dates were 1904. Kaiser's intelligence expedition. They were looking for the same thing 20 years ago. The last entry in the notebook, written in Gothic script, read, "We were mistaken. This is not Shambhala. This is a cage. And we are not guests, we are food. It does not kill us immediately, it protects us. It loves to play." Hans is still alive. I can hear it breaking his fingers one by one, slowly, to make him scream. He likes the sound. Volkov slammed the notebook shut and shoved it into his pocket. He didn't translate this for his men. They didn't need to know what awaited them. They were better off assuming death would be quick. But, looking at the bear pressed into the wall, he understood. It wouldn't be quick. Here, death is an art, and the artist doesn't like to rush. The smell of ozone became unbearable. Now it was mixed with the smell of scorched wool. Ahead, in the darkness of the tunnel, 2 dots of light began to glow. They were positioned 2.5 meters above the floor. Yellow with vertical pupils, they didn't blink, they simply stared. And there was no beastly fury in that gaze. It held the cold, analytical interest of a vivisectionist examining a new batch of laboratory mice. The mice brought iron rods with them that make a booming sound. It's funny, it's something new. The creature took a step forward and the floor beneath the people's feet shook. The torchlight flickered, revealing the outline of something massive, covered in white, matted fur that resembled dirty snow. But the anatomy of this body was wrong. The arms were too long, the knees bent at an odd angle. It stood blocking the passage, slowly opening and closing its fists. The sound of cracking knuckles was louder than the gunshots. The forensic examination was over. The slaughter began. The first 3 seconds of contact in the cave are described in Volkov's diary as a moment of absolute zero. Time stood still. 30 armed men stared into the yellow eyes hanging in the darkness, their brains refusing to give the command to their fingers on the triggers. It was biological stupor, an evolutionary mechanism that forces prey to freeze in front of a predator in the hopes that it won't notice. But this creature noticed everything. It saw their heat signatures, heard the blood pounding in its temples, and smelled the adrenaline that filled its stone sack. This smell was a signal for him to begin his meal. The creature did not growl. It took a deep breath, inflating its chest to an unnatural size, and emitted a sound that could not be called a scream. It was a sonic boom. An infrasound wave with a frequency of about 7 hertz struck the squad like a physical battering ram. People's eardrums instantly burst. Blood spurted from their ears and noses. Lamps and glass lanterns exploded, showering the floor with shards. In the ensuing darkness, broken only by red circles before the eyes of the shell-shocked people, panic began. "Fire! Fire in the eyes!" Volkov's cry was drowned out by the roar when the first machine gunner finally pulled the trigger on the Lewis. In the confined space, the sound of gunshots was like a hammer blow to the head. Muzzle flashes lit up the cave with strobe lights. In this ragged, pulsating light, the fighters saw a nightmare. The creature was no longer there. It wasn't running, it was flowing. His body, defying the laws of gravity and inertia, soared vertically upward, clinging to the unevenness of the vault with limbs that bent in all directions. It was the vertical death strategy. People were used to fighting in a 2-dimensional plane. They aimed at chest level. But death came from the ceiling. The creature moved across the stalactites with the grace of a giant spider, moving its paws faster than a man could move a rifle barrel. The first victim was the very same machine gunner who opened fire. A shadow fell from the ceiling. There was no sound of landing. All that could be heard was a wet crunch. The creature landed squarely on the soldier's shoulders, breaking his collarbones with the weight of its body. Lewis, who weighed 12 kilograms, was knocked out of his hands and sent flying against the wall, doubled over. The fighter didn't even have time to scream. The monster grabbed his head with one hand and his torso with the other. With a short, sharp movement, reminiscent of breaking a chicken bone, he turned his head 180 degrees. His body went limp. The creature tossed the corpse aside and instantly vanished into the darkness, leaping back onto the wall. The entire process took a second and a half. This wasn't a fight. It was surgery. Effective, fast, and absolutely merciless. Hell broke loose in the cave. The discipline Volkov had instilled in his men for years evaporated. All that remained was an animal instinct: kill or be killed. The soldiers fired in all directions. Bullets ricocheted off the granite walls, sending up showers of sparks and hitting their own. Someone screamed, clutching a bullet-riddled knee. Someone prayed. Someone simply fired at the ceiling until the firing pin began to click in vain. Volkov, his back pressed against the rock, tried to pick out a target in the erratic flashes. He saw fragments of horror. There was a flash of white fur soaked in dirt. There was a clawed paw like an excavator's bucket, snatching another person from the crowd. The soldier was lifted into the air. He kicked his legs, trying to reach the enemy with his knife, but the blade bounced off his skin with a clang, as if it was steel armor. The creature clenched its fingers. There was a sound of cracking ribs, like dry twigs cracking in a fire. The soldier fell silent, and his body, transformed into a ragdoll, flew into the midst of the squad, knocking down the living. It was the choreography of death. The monster used chaos as a weapon, deliberately throwing the bodies of the dead at those still trying to resist, breaking the line. He knocked out the light sources. The last torch, lying on the floor, was trampled under a broad, flat foot. Now the only light was the flashes of gunfire, which became increasingly rare. People were afraid to shoot, not knowing who was in front of them, friend or foe. In the darkness, only the heavy breathing of the creature, which was moving through the cave at an impossible speed, and the sounds of blows could be heard. The dull, wet slap of flesh against stone. The smell of ozone gave way to the scent of ruptured intestines and hot copper. The floor became slick with blood. Men fell, slipping on the remains of their comrades, and never rose again. They were not allowed out of the darkness. Volkov understood the enemy's tactics. It was Terran combined with mimicry. The creature would burst into the group of people, inflicting horrific injuries with its claws, and then retreat, melting into the shadows. It prevented them from focusing their fire. It was everywhere and nowhere. At some point, the commissar heard the voice of his deputy, Lieutenant Smirnov. The voice was coming from a side passage. "Comrade Commander, this way. This is the exit. Hurry!" Volkov rushed toward the voice, but immediately stopped, struck by a terrible realization. Smirnov had been killed 5 minutes earlier. Volkov had seen him torn in half. His chest lay at the commissar's feet. Who had called him then? Smirnov's voice came out of the darkness again, but now it had distorted, vibrating notes. "Here, faster. It's here." The creature imitated the voices of its victims, using their last words as bait. It possessed an intelligence superior to human. It didn't just kill bodies, it mocked minds. "Don't listen!" Volkov yelled over the noise of battle. "It wasn't them. Fight to the death. Bayonets ready!" But no one was listening to him anymore. The remnants of the detachment, about 10 men, maddened with terror, scattered in all directions. Someone ran towards Smirnov's voice and disappeared into the darkness with a short sob. Someone tried to hide in the cracks between the stones. It was the end of organized resistance. Volkov was left alone in the midst of the carnage. He raised his Mauser and fired into the void. A flash caught the creature's face just a meter away. For a split second, their eyes met. Volkov didn't see animal rage. He saw boredom. The creature looked at him as if he were a tired toy. It lazily waved its paw, and the pistol flew out of the commissar's hand, along with 2 fingers. The pain came later. At first there was surprise. How could he move so quickly? The blow sent Volkov flying back against the wall. He hit the back of his head and slid down, losing consciousness. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed his mind was a scene of final destruction. The creature stood in the center of the cave, holding a person in each hand. It slowly squeezed its fingers, and the people screamed in unison until their screams turned into gurgling sounds. The monster raised its head toward the cave ceiling and let out a triumphant roar. But it wasn't a roar of triumph. It was a signal, a challenge. And from somewhere deep within the mountain, from the very bowels of the earth, other voices answered. Dozens of them. It was a pack. The expedition hadn't simply awakened one animal, it had entered a hive. The diary describes this episode after the fact, with a trembling hand, the left one, as the right one was crippled. The pages are stained with something dark. The text is jumbled, almost incoherent. They are not animals. They are the gods of this mountain, and we are the sacrifice. I hear them eating. They are chomping. My God, they're making a louder noise than the machines in a factory. I'm crawling. I can't feel my legs. I left my people there. I'm a traitor. But I have to write this down. The world needs to know that we are not alone on this planet, and our neighbors are very hungry. There is a gap in the notes. Apparently, the commissar crawled in the darkness for several hours or days, periodically losing consciousness. But the chronology of events can be reconstructed based on the nature of the injuries on the bodies found later. NKVD experts who performed the autopsy on the remains a year later were shocked by the nature of the injuries. This was not a random murder. Many soldiers were missing specific organs: the liver, heart, brain. The rest of the body was intact. The predator selected the best pieces, rich in vitamins and fats. The rest he saved for later or simply discarded. This behavior is typical of creatures that do not experience a shortage of food. People were a delicacy to them, a rare treat that came to the table of its own accord. When Volkov came to, silence returned. But now it was a different silence. The silence of a crypt. The air was heavy and damp. It no longer smelled of blood, but of something sour, of gastric juice and decomposition. The commissioner felt a pencil stub in his pocket. He couldn't find his diary in the darkness, so he started writing on whatever was at hand. On the cuffs of his jacket, on the bandages. I see light. Not electric, phosphorescence. The walls are glowing. It's fungus or slime. I see where I am. This is the pantry. Here they hang. Volkov found himself in the Yetis' food warehouse. The bodies of his comrades, as well as the bodies of the basmatchi and animals, were stuck to the walls with the same sticky substance they had seen before. Some were still alive, moving in their mucus cocoons, but making no sound. Their vocal cords had been paralyzed or removed. The creatures kept the meat fresh. This was the culmination of horror, the realization that death wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was becoming a living can of food for a Pleistocene relic. Volkov tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey him. His spine was damaged. He could only crawl. And he crawled. Not toward the exit, because he didn't know the exit. He crawled away from the gaze of those hanging on the walls. Away from the eyes of Lieutenant Smirnov, who looked at him from his cocoon with a silent question. Why are you alive? This question will haunt the Commissar until the last second of his life. It will become his personal hell, more terrifying than the fangs of the monster. But now he needed only one thing: to find a place where he could hide and die as a man, and not as a piece of meat on the wall. He crawled into a narrow gap where the monster's massive body couldn't squeeze through. He heard footsteps behind him, the heavy, leisurely steps of the owner, who had returned to check his supplies. And this owner was not alone. What Commissar Volkov saw in the depths of the cave complex was not just a beast's lair. It was a biological temple, built on the bones of those who had been careless enough to enter here over the past 500 years. Here, in a huge natural hall, the vault of which was lost in the darkness, its own perverted ecosystem reigned. The air was so thick with ammonia and pheromones that it could be cut with a knife. It was an atmosphere unsuitable for humans, but ideal for a species that had evolved in isolation from the rest of the world. The only source of light was a chemical bomb that had fallen from the bag of one of the dead soldiers. She lay on the edge of the stone terrace, hissing and spitting magnesium sparks. This uncertain, jerky light, creating a strobe effect, snatched fragments of the nightmare from the darkness, not allowing the mind to assemble the whole picture at once. And perhaps it was for the best. A human brain, having seen it all, would have simply shut down from overload. In the center of the hall, on a raised platform of flat stones, reminiscent of a sacrificial altar, was the Alpha. This was the very same specimen that destroyed the advanced detachment. Now that he was no longer hidden in the shadows, his anatomy was revealed in all its monstrous efficiency. This wasn't a scaled-up human or a giant ape. It was a distinct evolutionary branch, a dead end for us, but perfect for them. The creature stood over 3 meters tall. Its proportions violated the golden ratio. Its arms, hanging below its knees, were thicker than the torso of an adult man. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the mass. It was the texture. The hair covering the body wasn't fur in the traditional sense. These were tough, keratinized fibers, resembling chitinous armor or a tangle of wires. They were white as the snow on the peaks. But now this white color was stained with brown streaks. The camouflage created by nature for the icy deserts here in the cave worked like a sniper's camouflage robe. The creature's muscular system was a biological paradox. Volkov, lying in his crevice and afraid to even blink, saw the knots of muscle rippling beneath the monster's skin. They didn't resemble human biceps. These were ropes twisted under monstrous tension. The density of the muscle fibers was such that they acted like natural body armor. That's why Lewis's bullets couldn't stop him. The 7.71mm lead simply stuck in this flesh, not reaching the vital organs. A bullet hitting such a muscle would flatten, losing kinetic energy, and be pushed outward by tissue contraction. It was real-time regeneration, coupled with the super density of matter. The creature was a tank made of flesh and bone. His skeleton, judging by the width of his shoulders and the thickness of his wrists, was capable of withstanding a fall from the height of a 10-story building. It was battle physics, a game in which 20th century human technology was thoroughly outclassed. Nearby there were other specimens, 5 of them. A pack, a family. They were smaller but no less dangerous. They moved around their leader with a fluid, flowing grace that belied their size. These were the movements not of primates, but of insects. Jagged lines, sharp jerks, instant freezes. Their joints were hyper-flexible, allowing their limbs to bend at any angle. This explained how they could climb along the ceiling and squeeze through narrow cracks. Their lidless eyes glowed yellow in the light of the magnesium bomb. The tapetum lucidum, the layer behind the retina that reflects light, was so highly developed that their eyes looked like 2 flashlights. They could see in absolute darkness. They saw warmth. They saw fear. Volkov realized they knew he was there. They just didn't see him as a threat. For them, he was a desert that wouldn't go anywhere. The scene that unfolded on the altar was the final act of the expedition's destruction. There was a man still alive lying there. It was the same Cossack who had asked about the shadow. He was conscious. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling where clusters of bats hung. The monster wasn't killing him, it was studying him. A huge finger with a black, chisel-like claw carefully, almost tenderly, ran across the man's stomach, ripping open his uniform but not touching the skin. The creature then leaned down and inhaled the scent of the entrails. It was an act of tasting. The man screamed as the monster slowly began to squeeze his leg. The crunch of the femur sounded like a gunshot, but the monster didn't stop. It continued to crush, turning the leg into a mess of bone meal and blood. He was testing the strength of the material, wondering how much pressure this fragile structure could withstand before it finally broke. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the cold curiosity of a child disassembling a beetle. Volkov closed his eyes, but the sound remained. The cave's soundscape was a symphony of pain. The Cossacks' cries were mingled with other sounds. In the shadowed corner, someone was chomping. It was damp, loud, and smacking. The females were feeding there. They were tearing at something large and soft. Volkov saw a hand in the sleeve of an OGPU overcoat fly into the air. It described an arc and fell at the feet of the Alpha unit. The leader picked it up, sniffed it, and tossed it aside with disdain. Too much fabric, too little meat. They were gourmets. They preferred liver and heart, rich in micronutrients. The rest went to waste or was used as feed for the young. Volkov realized a terrible truth. To them, humans are simply walking protein containers. We consider ourselves the top of the food chain, the kings of nature. But here, in these mountains, we are cattle. Cattle that have become too arrogant and have come to the slaughterhouse themselves. The magnesium flare began to fade. The light turned red, ominous. In this dying light, Volkov saw the pack's behavior change. They were finished eating. It was time for something else. The leader raised his head and emitted a low, vibrating sound that made the stones beneath the commissar's belly vibrate. It was the rally signal. The remaining specimens froze, turning their heads toward Alpha. Then they began singing. It wasn't a song in the human sense. It was a complex modulation of sounds on the border between ultrasound and infrasound. Volkov felt his head begin to ache, and his nose began to bleed again. This was communication. They were exchanging information. They were discussing something complex, beyond the comprehension of the primitive human mind. Perhaps they were discussing migration routes, or ways to preserve leftover food. Or, worst of all, they were planning their next hunt. And judging by the way they turned their heads towards the exit of the cave, they were interested in the outside world. When the light faded completely, darkness descended, worse than any torture. In this darkness, sounds grew louder. Volkov heard them approaching him. The rustle of coarse fur on stone, heavy breathing. The smell of rotten meat and ozone became unbearable. He realized his time was up. He was left for the last bit. He was the commander, the leader of this small herd of two-legged creatures, and according to pack law, the leader had to kill him. Volkov felt the handle of the broken knife. The blade was gone. Only a stub of metal remained. A pitiful weapon against a creature that could break steel rifles with its teeth. But he wasn't about to give up. The cold rage of the doomed awoke within him. If he died, he'd at least try to spoil their appetites. Suddenly, a new sound rang out in the darkness. A mechanical grinding sound. Somewhere deep in the cave, behind the monsters, something turned on. It was the sound of a mechanism working. Old, rusty, but still alive. Volkov couldn't believe his ears. It was the sound of ventilation. Deep underground, a machine pumping air was in operation. This meant the legends of Shambhala and the German maps were true. There really was an object here. And these creatures weren't just wild animals. They were guardians, a biological security system created long ago by someone to protect the entrance. And they accomplished their task brilliantly. The OGPU expedition was destroyed. The secret remained a secret. The monsters prevented outsiders from reaching the gate. But this thought brought no relief. It only intensified the horror. If these were guards, then who were their masters? Or are the owners gone, and the watchdogs continue to serve for millennia, devouring everyone who comes close? Volkov felt a cold, slimy paw grab his leg. The force of the tug sent him flying 3 meters through the air and slamming into the wall. The air was knocked from his lungs. He fell onto a pile of bones. Bones that didn't belong to people. They were the skulls of other creatures, enormous with fangs. The Yetis ate their own. Cannibalism was the norm in this hell. A shadow loomed over Volkov. He couldn't see his face, but he felt hot breath on his cheek. The creature sniffed him. It was deciding whether to kill him outright or let him play. "Go on," Volkov croaked, spitting out blood. "Eat him, you bastard." He didn't pray, he cursed. He cursed Boki, he cursed the party, he cursed the mountains. But most of all, he cursed himself for leading his people into this biological apocalypse. The creature made a sound like a chuckle and turned away. It didn't kill him. It grabbed him by the broken leg and dragged him deeper into the cave, to where the mysterious mechanism was working. Volkov screamed in pain as he was dragged over sharp rocks, but his cries were drowned out by the hum of the ventilation system. They weren't carrying him to a storage room. They were carrying him to an incubator. There, among the rocks, lay huge, leathery eggs, yearning for the warmth of a living body. His fate was worse than death. He was destined to become part of the breeding cycle of this species. The last thing his fading mind registered before the pain shock was the texture of the walls deep in the corridor. It wasn't stone, it was metal. Dull, grey metal covered in hieroglyphs. They came for the ancients' technology, and they found it. But the price for this discovery was higher than life itself. The price was eternity as a living thermostat for the progeny of monsters. The darkness closed in. The symphony of death gave way to the monotonous hum of a machine that pumped air for those who should have slept forever, but woke up to eat. The last pages of Commissar Volkov's diary were not found in the cave. They were discovered 30 years later, in 1955, during a secret geological survey of uranium. A scroll of bloody bandages and scraps of maps was stuffed into a ventilation shaft that opened to the surface 3 kilometers from the main entrance. This is a message in a bottle, sent by a man who knew his body would never leave the incubator. The handwriting on these scraps of cloth changes. At first, these are the firm, clipped phrases of an officer who is trying to maintain his sanity by taking notes. Then the letters begin to blur, losing their geometry. This is no longer written by a person, but by a piece of living flesh, connected to the life support system of an alien species. But the meaning of what was written remains clear to the last detail. This is not just a suicide note. It is a report on the inspection of the expedition's final destination. Shambhala was found. But it wasn't a city of sages. It was a factory. I'm writing this in the dark. There's no light, but I see. My eyes have adjusted, or perhaps the air here has a property of glowing. I'm lying on a metal grate. Below it is an abyss. Heat is radiating from there. This isn't a geothermal vent. It's the exhaust of a gigantic machine. I can hear pistons churning somewhere deep within the mountain. A rhythmic, low hum. The beating of the Earth's heart. It's hot here, 45 degrees. My skin is dry and cracked, but I don't sweat. They take the moisture. I'm in the incubator. It's a huge room, the walls lined with lead sheets. I checked with a knife. The shavings are soft and heavy. The ancients knew how to protect their offspring from radiation. But here it's radioactive. My gums aren't bleeding from the blows. It's radiation sickness. We were looking for a weapon capable of changing the world. We found it. It's dormant in the eggs. Volkov describes the clutch in frightening detail. It's not a chaotic pile of eggs like those of snakes or birds. It's an orderly structure. Rows of knee-high leather capsules installed in special niches in the floor. Each egg is connected to a trough through which a nutritious liquid flows. The liquid is dark, thick, and smells of iron. The commissar realized where this fluid was coming from. He saw the females bringing body parts of his fighters and throwing them into special tanks in the center of the hall. There, in an acidic environment, organic matter decomposes to the state of a primordial broth, which is then fed into the embryo's nutritional system. The OGPU expedition's men literally became fertilizer for the next generation of monsters. I see Lieutenant Smirnov, Volkov writes, or rather his unit. His head floats in the liquid. His eyes are open. He's looking at the eggs. He's feeding them with himself. It's a perfect recycling cycle. Not a gram of protein is wasted. The author's psychology at this moment balances on the brink of cold protocol and madness. He tries to count the number of eggs. Sector A, 200 units. Sector B, another 300. The hall stretches off into infinity. There are thousands of them here. This isn't a population of a rare species. It's an army. An invading army, mothballed until needed. Who created them? Nature doesn't build lead incubators with hydroponic systems. It's bioengineering. The Germans were looking for their Aryan ancestors. We were looking for communism. What they found was a Paleolithic biological weapon that escaped the control of its creators and devoured them. Volkov understands the scale of the threat. If these thousands of eggs hatch, it will be the end of humanity. These creatures are stronger, faster, and smarter than us. They know no mercy. To them, we're just sacks of meat running too slowly. At some point, the footage is interrupted by a strange observation. Volkov notices that the machine's hum has changed. The vibration has increased. The heat has become unbearable. His balls have begun to pulsate. The shells became transparent, and silhouettes became visible inside. These were not helpless fetuses. They were miniature versions of the adults, with already formed claws and teeth. They weren't sleeping. They were thrashing against the capsule walls, trying to escape. The cycle is complete, is scratched into a piece of leather. We awakened them. Our arrival, our shooting, our warmth. All of this triggered the activation mechanism. We became the catalyst. I hear a crack. It's the sound of skin tearing. They're coming out. At that moment, the final break occurs. Volkov understands that he is more than just a witness. He is the newborn's first breakfast. He was left here for a reason. The adults didn't kill him because the cubs need fresh, warm blood for their first feeding. It's an initiation ritual. He lies among the rows of eggs, like a served platter. One of them has broken through the shell. He's looking at me. He's the size of a dog, but his eyes are old. There is no childhood in them. They have only hunger and the knowledge of how to kill. He does not squeak. He hisses. His fur is white and wet. He tastes the air with his tongue. He senses my fear. Oh my God, there are thousands of them here, and they're all looking at me. The physical end of the recording comes abruptly. There are no farewells to the family. There are no slogans for Stalin. There is only the recording of a biological fact. It jumped. It bit the tendon in my hand. There is no pain. There is cold. I see the others running up. They're tearing apart the bandages. They're eating the blood-soaked paper. I hide this piece of paper in the pipe. If you're reading this, seal the entrance. Blow up the mountain. Don't try to study them. They can't be killed with a bullet. They can only be burned along with the mountain. The text ends with a bold line that goes down, tearing through the paper. This is the moment when the pencil, or whatever he was writing with, fell from his hand and his body jerked in agony. The writing didn't end with a period. It ended with a stain of brown liquid, which, if looked at under a microscope, contains fragments of human tissue and the saliva of a primate unknown to science. The story of the 1925 expedition was buried in the Lubyanka archives, under the heading, Keep Forever. The official version for relatives. They died heroically in an avalanche while carrying out a government assignment. But avalanches don't leave teeth marks on metal. In 1926, the NKVD carried out Operation Quarantine. A sapper battalion was deployed to the Pamirs region. They blew up the pass, dumping thousands of tons of rock into the gorge entrance. Local residents were displaced 100 kilometers away. Maps were redrawn. The peaks were given new names. The Soviet government knew how to keep secrets. They thought they'd buried the problem under rocks, but they didn't know the biology of this species. The Yeti isn't just a predator. It's an organism capable of hibernating for decades. Without food, without air, trapped under tons of rock, they can slow their metabolism to zero, waiting for the outside world to open the door again. And this world is already knocking at your door. Today, the site of Volkov's death is no longer a restricted area. Popular hiking trails for extreme sports enthusiasts run there. Climbers in bright jackets take selfies against the backdrop of rocks under which an army of ancient killers sleeps. They don't know that the strange hum they hear at night is not the wind. This is the ancient ventilation system working, which has started pumping heat into the incubator again. Recently, satellite images taken in the infrared range appeared on the internet. They show that the slope temperature in this area has increased by 4 degrees over the past year. The snow is melting faster than expected. Geologists talk about global warming. Conspiracy theorists talk about secret tests. But the truth lies in that lead tube containing the Commissar's diary. The awakening cycle is exactly 100 years. 1925. 2025. The mathematics of death are simple and inexorable. The timer, started a century ago, is counting down the final seconds. And if, while you're in the mountains, you suddenly smell ozone and copper, and there is a sudden complete silence all around you, do not try to run. Your ancestors with rifles and grenades couldn't escape. Just close your eyes. It's the only thing you can do, because they're already awake. And they're very hungry after a century of sleep. History doesn't repeat itself, it reloads. And this time, we don't even have a Mauser.